Hello guys. We are going to be really cramming a lot of information in this lesson this time to get us caught up to where the Civil War begins. So I'm going to be cramming basically 3 whole chapters into this one little lesson. So we're going to fly through it. It's going to be kind of choppy, but stick with me and we'll get to the Civil War by the end of this. So, we're starting in 1826. So at this point, America has been the United States for now 50 years, independent from Britain. And so this is what the map would look like. We had not expanded fully all the way west yet. We didn't have this territory completely, but we were in the process of claiming it and fighting for it. But the actual civilized United States was all this green area that it had claimed and taken over. So when we start in 1826, James Monroe is president, and he issued the Monroe Doctrine. And this Monroe Doctrine basically was a threat to all European countries that said the Western Hemisphere, the west side of the Americas, was not for their exploration or for them to immigrate to, but it was for Americans to continue to expand on. Another thing that he did was during this time they issued the American Indian Removal Act. So any Indian nations that were still throughout mostly the southern areas, they were forced to relocate to what we know today as Oklahoma. And this one tiny area of Oklahoma became the Indian territory that they were allowed to live on. So this wasn't an easy thing. This wasn't a peaceful thing. This was more of a forced thing. And the Indians, of course, fought hard and fought back. But because of their small numbers and small areas, they were easily taken over. And so they were forced to migrate into this allowed territory. Now you can imagine all the different tribes coming together in this one area was not going to be easy, peaceful living for them. So that's where we get the Trail of Tears. You can see there the Trail of Tears, the red arrows, the migration patterns from this Indian Removal Act in America. So if you've ever heard of the Trail of Tears, that was this journey. So it wasn't one of want to, it was one of they had to. Andrew Jackson becomes president by 1829, and he is the one who, when all of this is taking place, he is actually president by this point. So first we had James Monroe, then we have Andrew Jackson during this time. And then we go into the Industrial Revolution. So as we're starting to expand west, and we're trying to get the Native American tribes kind of more focused into one tiny little area that we're allowing them to have, we are starting to industrialize, which means inventions and machinery and factories, canals, which we said were man-made waterways, and the railroads, so they could transport many more supplies back and forth. The North was mostly in charge of the factories, and then the South is more going to be in charge of like the farming. So this Industrial Revolution starts a whole new lifestyle, especially in the North. Something else that takes place at this point is, you know how we talked about the Great Awakening was a time when the Pilgrims had this Great Awakening where they focused back on their religion and their relationship with God and their morals and their values and what they really wanted out of America. Well, that kind of takes place again. And so we have the Second Great Awakening. And so this was a time where they thought things needed to change. They had revivals. They kind of focused back on their morals and relationship with God and their Christian beliefs. And so they began to start to ban things like alcohol because they believed that people were drinking too much. They began to start to look at things more like slavery as an evil act And so it began this new focus on creating a better world and getting rid of things that were causing problems. So slavery was an issue. Women having rights was an issue, and things like that they thought were holding back America. So the Second Great Awakening and the reform or the change needed is one of the first things that starts the whole abolitionist movement, where they wanted to abolish slavery. So the abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, he was one of the main ones that had the loudest voice. He was a powerful man who had escaped slavery himself, and he fought kind of similar to how we know Martin Luther King fought. He fought for them to end slavery as well. So this abolitionist movement, fighting against slavery, the fighting for women's rights, for equality there so women could have rights, began in about the 1830s. And then the women's rights focus was around the 1840s. Okay, so we move into chapter 13. And we start to see the United States looks a little different here. See, we've now added further down in here into Texas and over here in this Western Hemisphere. So how we came about getting those was, of course, not easy either. The Manifest Destiny, that's what it was called, Manifest Destiny, was basically an issue to expand west all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and it was like the goal that's what the U.S. wanted to do, was go from the Atlantic to the Pacific and claim all that land in between. Now, originally, remember, Spain had a lot of land over here in the west and in down here in Texas. So this issue of Texas belonging to Mexico or belonging to America was fought for and debated for over 10 years, and it ended up leading us into the Mexican War. So the Mexican War was in 1846. James Polk was president during this time, and let's see, let me turn over a couple pages. Here you can see a really good picture of what our area looked like. So we have the United States here. Then we start to expand. We gained this area from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Then by 1818, we gained this little bit and put up this border here. Well, not a real border, but a border line between Canada by gaining this little area from Britain. We gained Florida from Spain in 1819. And then we end up fighting over this area for a long time. So after we win the Mexican War, we gain all of this area here. And a little while later, we gain the Gadsden Purchase, which was also purchased from Mexico. And so we gained this whole area here that we had fought Mexico over, all of this. Now the downside, of course, is for the Mexicans, they were pushed out of New Mexico, or they could choose to become Mexican Americans. And so these new Mexican Americans could stay and just become part of the United States and not have to leave their current homes. And so a lot of them chose to do that. I guess, if you want to call it a good side to it, was that they purchased this land after they won the war. America purchased this land for $15 million. This area in orange here. They gave Mexico $15 million for this area, and then they later purchased this area for $10 million more. So $25 million was given for this land, and also, of course, the battles from the war. So by this point, we have gained this Oregon territory, some of this up here in North Dakota. We've gained California and down into Texas. And a lot of the Mexican Americans are going to be living in that area as well. Oregon became a land that they thought a lot of people would want to live in and try this new area. And so the Oregon Trail was a 2,000-mile route that a lot of people ended up starting to migrate into Oregon around like the 1840s to 1860s. So if you've ever heard of the Oregon Trail, I know there's a game. The Oregon Trail was that migration that a lot of people took to go farther west than we had been before, or maybe they had lived before. So you can see the Oregon Trail routes here on this page. Also, at some point, let's see, around 1848, I believe, 1848, a man was making a sawmill in California, and as they were digging to build this new sawmill, they struck gold in the ground. They found gold out in California. So, of course, everybody then started wanting to migrate into California. And so, the population you can see here in California, there was only 800 people in 1847. Fast forward, and by 1860, there's 57,000 people. So the population in California just boomed after hearing that there was gold out in California. So a lot of people took off out there in this gold rush, and in 1849, and so they became known as the 49ers, and a lot of them were very disappointed when they got there and they could not find gold, or it was very little that they did find after all their hard work of mining it and trying to find it. So, and mining was a very hard, dangerous job. So this California gold rush did not end in a lot of gold as they expected, but it did get a higher population out into our western side of the United States. Now, we're going to go into chapter 14, which is where we really start to get into this beginning processes of the Civil War. Here you can kind of see a timeline. Takes us from 1820 all the way into 1867. So that's what this next chapter is going to get us through. And then some pretty important people that we'll meet in this chapter as well. There's some of y'all's favorites. Harriet Tubman. Okay, so in this chapter 14, we'll start with the North versus the South. There was always a huge difference between these two regions, the North versus the South. Geographically, because it was such a different climate and such a different way of life, but also kind of their belief systems and stuff too. In the North, it was more urban life, city life, and in the South, it was rural, like constant plantations and farmlands, and people were a lot more spread out, smaller towns, smaller way of lives, plantations. Whereas in the North, they were working more on larger populations of towns, big cities, with different goals of factory way of life and machinery and mass production of materials. So in the biggest split happened in 1846. Congress passed a law to lower taxes that the U.S. was going to be charged for goods that were imported from other countries. Well, the North was really mad about this because they thought, well, the Southern people are going to start buying from other countries because it's cheaper if you lower their taxes. So the South loved it because they thought, well, it's going to be cheaper to buy from Great Britain and just import goods from them than to buy from the North. Well, that's not going to help the United States economy in the North, but it's going to help in the South. So this law that passed this tax, that Congress passed this law about this lowering this tax of imported goods from other countries, created what we call sectionalism, which means it's a loyalty to a section or part of the country rather than the whole country itself. So one way of life in the United States was actually threatening the other way of life in the United States. So if the South started buying from Great Britain, it would do a lot of damage to the North's economy. But if the North was overcharging the South, then it would do damage to the South's economy. So it kind of pushed them against each other and created this sectionalism that kind of already existed. So by 1850, another main issue, the northern states had outlawed slavery. However, factories paid workers really low amounts, and a lot of these factory workers were previously freed slaves or African Americans who lived in this area. Well, they had horrible working conditions, low pay, but they were considered free men, yet they weren't given like full citizenship, so they couldn't vote or they couldn't own property in certain states, and so they weren't treated equally at all. Well, in the South, you had over 4 million slaves by this point in the 1850s, 60s, but the South argued that life was better for the slaves in the South than working for factories as freedmen in the North because they had a better life there, living out the working conditions were better and things like that. So it was a constant debate between the two. Not necessarily one wasn't right and one wasn't wrong as far as how they treated them, because they were both treating them unfairly and both treating them bad. But they wanted to argue at, well, who was treating them worse. So the North thought the South was treating them horribly because they were owning them as property, and they were right. But the South thought, well, you guys are treating them unfairly too. Just because you call them free doesn't mean you're treating them free. So it was a constant debate between the two sections, and it was a huge split between the two. So the slaves started resisting slavery. The more and more abolitionists spoke up, and the more and more the North started defending them. The slaves in the South started kind of fighting back and beginning to resist. Some ways that they began to resist was they would pretend to be sick, or they would work really slowly. They would purposely break tools, plan rebellions, and start to escape. So in the South, they started putting in these slave codes, which were laws to control the slaves' behavior. Look at this here. I'm going to attach this page and this page right here of the book, because I want you to actually read these two pages. I think you'll find it really interesting. This slave rebellion that Nat Turner did, it's a pretty interesting story about him. And then, of course, the Underground Railroad. I know a lot of you are interested in that. So I'm going to attach those two as documents for you to read a little bit more detailed information on. But most of you have heard of Harriet Tubman, because we know she was a slave that escaped and led people through the Underground Railroad. But you may not have heard of Levi Coffin, who was actually a white man who was also a leader in the Underground Railroad. So there's just some pretty cool stories here that I think you'll find interesting. So I'm going to attach those in later. By 1860, 1 out of 9 African Americans were free, but they had to have a certificate of freedom. And if they had escaped to the North, they could still be kidnapped by slave catchers that the South had put up in the North to go find their slaves. And then, of course, if they were free and up in the North, finding work was hard.